Good afternoon and welcome. Please take a seat if you'd like one. My name is Catherine Mitchell. I'm the Dean of the Social Sciences, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our event tonight. This is the 9th annual Right Livelihood Lecture. UC Santa Cruz is the first and only Right Livelihood College in North America. By linking activists and academics in service of people and the planet, we make vital contributions to the intellectual life of the campus and the community. Tonight's event is a student-initiated and student-run event hosted by the Right Livelihood Club at UC Santa Cruz. In a moment, I'm going to pass the mic to two Right Livelihood Club organizers. But first, I'd also like to thank the many other co-sponsoring organizations for the event tonight. The Albert Einstein Institution, the Institute for Social Transformation, the Social Sciences Division, Kresge College, Rachel Carson College, Politics, Anthropology, Sociology, and the Resource Center for Nonviolence. Also, we are pleased these will be the first events for the new Civic Discourse and Democratic Engagement Initiative of the UCSC Politics Department. So before we get started tonight, I'd like to give a land acknowledgement. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking UP tribe. The Ama Mutsun tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is working hard today to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and to heal from historical trauma. So now let me introduce our student speakers who are here to say a few words about and invite you to join the Right Livelihood Club. Elena Losada is a second-year PhD student in sociology, and Emily Rose Friedman is a fourth-year undergraduate student in politics.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name's Elena. I'm a second-year doctoral student in the sociology department and a founding member of the Right Livelihood Graduate Club here on campus, which is housed at the Institute for Social Transformation. The Grad Club is a place for graduate students to get connected to this amazing network of laureates, 183 Right Livelihood laureates, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel Prize, across 73 different countries. So to just say some names, Brian Stevenson, Amy Goodman, the Landless Workers Movement in Brazil, and Vandana Shiva, and many, many incredible others. So what's been great for me in 2 years of virtual graduate school is to be able to connect to a network of other Right Livelihood colleges and talk to student activists in places like India and Nigeria, in Argentina, about environmental and social struggles in our context and strategies and ways to collaborate. So the club has been a great platform, and the college, the Right Livelihood College, has been a great platform for that. Some other opportunities that the Grad Club offers are TA-ships, research opportunities with laureates, and opportunities to organize, to bring laureates to campus and organize events like this one, which we're really excited about. So I wanted to extend an invitation to our orientation next week. If anyone's interested, we're doing an evening orientation at the Grad Student Commons on Thursday, May 10th next week. And we'll be in the back at the table if you'd like more information about joining the Grad Club.
Thank you so much, Elena. That was beautiful. Thanks for being here, everybody. This is awesome. I just wanted to say a huge thank you. I'm so grateful to be here at UC Santa Cruz, and I'm glad that you guys all took the time to come out here and listen to us, and listen to Jamila. I'm just going to start by introducing the undergrads. The Right Livelihood College here in Santa Cruz is just such a privilege to have. We, like Jamila, like everyone has said so far, we are one of 9 colleges in the whole world. And it's just like such an opportunity that we have. And Carmela and myself and Elena and Isaac and everybody involved kind of just saw that opportunity for what it was and ran with it, all thanks to Dave Shaw and many other friends and family of Right Livelihood. So the first notion of right livelihood is to be an occupation that not only ensures us sustainable living, but also creates greater happiness, wisdom, and collective livelihood and well-being. As Elena has said, the Right Livelihood Award encourages change makers such as laureates, as she's named, but also Gene Sharp, Vandana Shiva, Edward Snowden, and Greta Thunberg, who we hope to have next year at our spring event, much like the one that you're attending right now. So thank you for being here. I want to introduce Jamila and Gene and what they're up to, what they have been up to. So Gene Sharp, like I said, won the Right Livelihood Award in 2012 for developing and articulating the core principles and strategies of nonviolent resistance and supporting their practical implementation in conflict areas around the world. In 1983, he founded the Albert Einstein Institution of Nonviolent Organization. He said that. And it was for specializing in methods of nonviolent resistance within conflict. Jamila joined Albert Einstein Institution in 2002 and worked with Gene Sharp for 15 plus years. Thank you for letting me introduce them, and just want to extend an invitation to any students that might be in the crowd, and anybody at all, really. Tomorrow we're having a workshop for deeper digging, deeper understanding behind the organization and the planning that goes on with these, to have successful struggles. Like Jamila's going to say, we are experiencing an all-time high of interest in social justice organization, but our effectiveness is at an all-time low. So instead of getting scared, we're going to get busy. And May the 9th, we are having an undergrad little dinner at Cal Coffee Shop to kind of introduce us and mingle and get inspired and stuff. All right, thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, you two, for your passion and enthusiasm and all the work you're doing for Right Livelihood. So for the event this evening, Building People Power, Lessons from Global Movements with Jamila Raqib, I want to give you a note about the format. Jamila will kick things off and speak for about 20 minutes, and then Professor Liz Beaumont will join her in conversation, at which time we would like to ask the audience if you'd like to have any questions answered. So if you do have some questions, write them on the 3x5 cards that you have received, and then you can pass them to Elena and David and Emily Rose at any time, or grab one from the Right Livelihood table in the back there. So we also have many people joining us from online, and so welcome to you all as well. And if you're coming from around the world, we encourage you to send us your questions. We'd really like to hear them as well. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Liz Beaumont, who is sitting in front of me here. Liz is an associate professor in politics and legal studies. Her research and teaching include a central focus on democratic engagement and how groups and movements claim rights and pursue legal and political change. She is the author of The Civic Constitution, Civic Visions and Struggles in the Path Towards Constitutional Democracy, and the co-author of 2 books on civic education and engagement. Among other roles, Liz works on nonpartisan voting projects with the All In Democracy Challenge, and she is with leaders from the university's Student Union Assembly. She also serves on the Academic Advisory Board for the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, and she co-founded the Puentes Initiative, a UCSC campus community partnership to help support the Santa Cruz immigrant community. Liz is also leading the new Civic Discourse and Democratic Engagement Initiative for the Politics Department. And this initiative is working to bring together students and community leaders to discuss society's challenges and gain skills for civic engagement. And she is thrilled that Jamila Raqib's talk and workshop are also the first events for that initiative. So another wonderful synergy. And now I'd like to introduce our star speaker tonight, Jamila Raqib. Thank you so much for coming, Jamila. We really, really appreciate it. And all the work you've done with our students is gold for us, so thank you. So Jamila is a specialist in the study and practice of strategic nonviolent action and the executive director of the Albert Einstein Institution, which works to advance the research and application of nonviolent action worldwide. For more than 15 years, she worked closely with the late Right Livelihood laureate, Dr. Gene Sharp, the world's foremost scholar in the field of strategic nonviolent action, and she collaborated on the publication of Self-Liberation, A Guide to Strategic Planning for Action to End a Dictatorship or Other Oppression. Since 2002, she's focused on the development and distribution of educational resources on nonviolent action and has conducted workshops on strategic planning for human rights organizations, universities, governmental bodies, and groups opposing dictatorship and combating corruption and struggling to attain political rights, economic justice, environmental protection, and women's empowerment. As a director's fellow at the MIT Media Lab, she conducted research on designing better systems for nonviolent action research and education. She's currently working on the development of a learning platform to help groups prepare strategic plans to conduct struggles for the defense and attainment of their civil and political rights. Please join me in welcoming Jamila to the stage.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you all so much for being here. It's truly an honor. And I just want to start by thanking everyone who made this possible. The Right Livelihood Club, Emily Rose and Carmela. We had long meetings, over months to make this possible. And of course, Dave Shaw. So thank you so much. And thank you for that introduction. Well, it's great to be back on this beautiful campus. Dave reminded me that I was here in 2018 for a Right Livelihood event. It was only a short visit. We've had a few days longer this time, but truly packed in. And we've been really impressed and energized with the kind of engagement here and the really deep solutions-oriented thinking that we found here. And it's been truly educational and inspiring. So again, thank you so much for this opportunity to be here together with all of you and everyone joining us online to think collectively about what's possible and what's needed in this moment of crisis and opportunity and responsibility for our world. To be having this conversation also with Professor Liz Beaumont is especially fitting given the focus of her important work and that of the new center, the Civic Discourse and Democratic Engagement Initiative, to understand and foster, what we like to call a civil resistance muscle, this sort of capacity to create better institutions and networks that can meet our needs and also to defend them. Our values and our ways of life, our communities seem to be increasingly under threat as we face a sort of perfect storm of conditions and compounding crises globally. It shouldn't come as a surprise to any of us that, around the world, people, especially young people, are feeling very discouraged and overwhelmed. We're seeing, obviously, the pandemic, its impact on marginalized communities, massive economic and racial inequality, the degradation of civil liberties, of reproductive rights, undermining of the press, marginalization of minority groups, and the rise of authoritarianism globally. And here in the United States, we're obviously not immune to these threats. And of course, we can't forget the existential threat of the climate crisis, which is causing massive anxiety globally, especially for young people and children. A major new study by the medical journal The Lancet from a few months ago found that 75% of respondents said that the future is frightening, and 45% said that the climate negatively affects their lives and their ability to function. And the study also found that the anxiety and anger and the feelings of powerlessness and guilt, they weren't just because the climate crisis existed, but really the feelings of betrayal that their governments had failed to act to protect them. So obviously this threat to the emotional well-being of children is distressing and disheartening. But I wonder whether there might be a silver lining to this global awakening, to the fact that many of the political systems and institutions that we've put our faith in have failed us. And yes, in the short term, that realization that our political systems are unwilling or incapable or unresponsive, it's painful. But in the long term, I wonder if it's a superpower. Because maybe with that realization comes the awareness of what we have to do, what our responsibilities are. And at least that's how it has been for me. So I was born in Afghanistan during the Soviet War and occupation of the country during the 1980s. And when I was 4 years old, I became a refugee along with my family and my community and millions of other Afghans who fled the country. So I'm sure it's not a surprise to you that the trauma of that experience, was hugely formative for me in so many ways. And one of the main ways it impacted me was that it left me with this sort of deep sense of vulnerability and powerlessness. I felt like me and my family, my community, we were collateral damage of the Cold War. We were helpless victims against whom massive violations could be committed, and there was really nothing we could do to protect ourselves because we were weak. And just as a weak person is more vulnerable to abuse, well, we as a weak society were also more vulnerable to oppression and violations against us. So along with that deep sense of vulnerability came a recognition that since no one was going to come to save us, as a family, as a society, we had to do it ourselves. So I was searching desperately, right, for this powerful way to develop that strength, to defend ourselves, to stop violations against us, and to build institutions and societies that really truly met the needs of our communities. But how to do that was a big question. And as I think it is for so many people who are also grappling with these massive, big, political problems. We understand the issues that are affecting our communities and the injustices that we face, but we often feel powerless to change them. So it was with this sort of backdrop that I started working with the great nonviolent resistance scholar, Gene Sharp. And I came to a realization, and some people think that it was in bits and pieces, a slow realization, but it was really a light bulb moment. Because I realized that this powerful tool that I had been searching for, it already existed. In fact, people have been using it for thousands of years. It just wasn't very well known or understood because all of our societies, both the one that I was born in and also the one I was raised in, and most of the others really had emphasized a history of war and violence, which left me with this mistaken belief that violence was the most powerful tool available to people who were facing oppression. But history shows us that it's, in fact, nonviolent struggle that is that powerful tool. So Gene Sharp came to that realization too, that nonviolent action holds huge potential as a political tool, that it has to be studied, that we have to better understand it. And when he started working in this field in the 1950s, it was in the midst of the McCarthy era and after World War II. He was looking out at what was a very dark world, which in many ways mirrors the world we're looking at today. The threat to democratic institutions and norms, the rise of authoritarianism, war, widespread economic and racial inequality. So I worked with Gene, as was said, for more than 15 years, and he was my mentor, he became a friend, and in a career that spanned 70 years, he wrote dozens of books on the topic of how people could build power and then use that power to more effectively struggle for rights and freedoms. Gene, as you may know, began his work as a Gandhi scholar, but he soon found that as remarkable as the Indian independence movement was, it wasn't completely unique. Gandhi was a brilliant practitioner of nonviolent action, but he didn't invent it. There were thousands of other cases where people had used nonviolent struggle to fight for their rights and freedoms, and Gene started studying these cases to see what he could learn. He asked questions like, when people made the choice to use nonviolent means, why did they make that choice, as opposed to using violence or doing nothing? When they were successful, what made them successful? And when they failed, what were those factors that either led to failure or to partial success? He found that most people who had used nonviolent action throughout history were incredibly brave and persistent, but they didn't really have access to a lot of knowledge and information. They were mostly operating based on trial and error, which meant they were often unprepared to face powerful opponents. But in spite of that, in spite of this lack of information, in spite of this operating based on intuition and improvisation, they were achieving these massive successes. So his thinking, and this is really what's driving our work today, is imagine how much more effective could people be if they had access to lessons and best practices and stories of what works, what doesn't work, and apply that in their own struggles. So one of our most popular resources that maybe you're familiar with are this 198 methods of nonviolent action. These are the individual methods of action that people have taken throughout history. Well, some of them, of course. They include the actions that many people conflate with the field, methods like marches or demonstrations, vigils, and street protests. But they also include what we consider more powerful methods, the methods of non-cooperation. These are methods like labor strikes, like economic boycotts, like political non-cooperation. They also include the methods of nonviolent intervention. These are the sort of more behind-the-scenes methods, but they're also the most powerful category of methods because they create alternative power. The sit-ins, the creation of new institutions, the new media, new economic systems and models, new councils, new systems for leadership. And these are really the ones that oppressive systems have the most difficult time withstanding. So this 198 methods list, it's still kind of the resource that gets the most attention, it gets people most excited, and it's really the most widely distributed. Of course, that might be because some of our books are more than 900 pages. But actually, I think the list is so popular the reason for that, I think, is because it's eye-opening, that there's this whole toolbox of individual actions that people can take, things you can do. And of course, that list is growing. As Gene knew would happen, he could have easily added a couple of methods and, rounded up to 200. But I think when he stopped at 198, it was to convey that that list is incomplete. That people will continue to discover new methods that driven by human imagination and creativity, of which there is an abundance in our world. So this experimentation and creativity, we're seeing it all over the world. I'm sure you have examples from your own communities. And it's encouraging to see that. But the real power of these methods comes from figuring out how these individual actions can be plugged into a wider strategy. And this is the tough work of movement building, of strategic planning, which is the planning for what to do, how to do it, when to do it, and how to prepare for the opponent's response. Carrying out struggles is complex. Dr. King said that unfortunately there's no neat row of buttons that we can press to get the outcomes that we want. But we do know that nonviolent action requires skills and capacities, that these can be studied, that they can be learned, and that there's some basic insights that can be very helpful to us. And I'd just like to share a couple here. So the first, I think, which is really fundamental here, is shifting how we think about power, political power in our societies. This is essential to figuring out how to get it and how to deny it, and how to use it to struggle effectively for the issues that we care about. In most of our societies, whether authoritarian systems or more democratic ones, we attribute more political power to our systems than they actually have. In fact, these systems rely on multitudes of people and groups to help them carry out their policies, which means that we, the people, hold a lot of untapped power by what we refuse to do and what we do. Second is the importance of mobilizing this untapped power by creating and strengthening groups and networks, not just online, but in our communities. We've seen lots and lots of examples during our time here in Santa Cruz. These groups are essentially pockets of power. Carrying out action through these groups where people trust each other, where they have experience working together, this is what makes collective action possible and ultimately more powerful than operating on our own. So in contexts where people are heavily fragmented, like in authoritarian societies where organizing is difficult and carries a lot of risk, political action has been carried out through all kinds of groups, not always the traditional NGO model or nonprofit organizations that have their papers, filed with the appropriate ministry, but lots of loose networks like gardening groups and sports associations. In fact, one of the major grounds for hope that I see in Afghanistan for me is that as terrible as things are right now, the last 20 years has seen the establishment of hundreds of these organizations and networks Not just NGOs, as I said, but also sports associations, cultural organizations, environmental groups, and other community groups. These groups are being used to organize people and ultimately also to push for policies. We're seeing this also in the Sudan, where the neighborhood resistance committees that were formed and created during the anti-dictatorship struggle, they're now being used to carry out resistance activities and also to coordinate with other groups to prevent the coup government from consolidating power and gaining international legitimacy. So I guess the question for us is, how do we create and strengthen these building blocks of power in our communities? And ideally before a crisis. It's sometimes difficult to do this once we're already in the midst of that. So how can we put these networks and groups in place? How can we strengthen the existing ones so that they can meet the needs of our society now, but also be used for resistance? Effectiveness in our struggles also requires that we move beyond just expressing dissatisfaction, what we don't like about the system and policies that are harming us, to actually creating a shared vision for the changes that we're seeking. People aren't going to join our movements just because we explain how bad things are and how much they need to change. In fact, just bringing attention to problems can be demobilizing if we don't also talk about what people can do to change the situation. People have to feel a sense of ownership of the struggle and its goals and how the alternative, vision is going to improve their lives. And the best movements have understood this. We saw in the civil rights movement that the goal wasn't just about ending unjust laws affecting African Americans. It was about a shared vision of a more just America that all Americans, white and black, should aspire to, and that future was within their reach. So in today's context, how can we create a more inclusive vision that could win over people who are undecided, win over people who may not believe change is even possible, in light of also the polarization and indecisiveness of our society and around the world. Another important requirement of effectiveness in nonviolent resistance is maintaining nonviolent discipline. It isn't always easy to prevent a movement from using violence, especially when people are facing severe repression. But violence has a counterproductive role, and it can undermine a movement in a number of ways. Violence by a movement, even if it's used by a small number of participants, is used to justify repression against the whole movement. People who advocate for violence to defend vulnerable people from a place of wanting to be good allies may actually be putting them at greater risk. Violence also demobilizes supporters in the movement because fewer people are usually willing to participate in movements once they turn violent. And since nonviolent movements rely not just on numbers, but also on diverse participation of women, of younger people, of older folks, people from all walks of life, this is another way in which violence weakens a movement. Violence is what opponents want for a number of reasons. They're just better equipped to deal with it. That's why there's a long history of opponents putting infiltrators and agent provocateurs in movements in order to provoke violence and advocate it and even commit it in the name of the resistance. Because it shifts the way the struggle is being fought to a means in which the opponents, have the upper hand. And although it helps, a moral commitment to nonviolence is not necessary to keep nonviolent discipline. In most cases throughout history, people understood that not using violence was actually a pragmatic choice. It was a political calculation. They understood that it would offer them certain advantages. I think communicating this point in our own movements is extremely important because people facing difficult circumstances, they really hate being told that violence is morally wrong when they have been at the receiving end of a lot of state violence and oppression. Training and education is an important way that movements can foster nonviolent discipline. The late Congressman John Lewis, whose massive achievements for social justice are being honored on this campus tomorrow, understood the importance of training and education so that action could be coordinated, so it could be consistent with a wider strategy, so that it could actually help to achieve objectives, so that people could keep nonviolent discipline, and so that they could do all of this even when things get tough or they're facing risk. So this need for training and capacity building is important. It's more important than ever before because we are facing increasingly sophisticated opponents. They're learning to be more effective, to adapt, which means that movements must also adapt and be as organized, if not more so, than the entities that they're fighting. This education and capacity building piece is the focus of the Albert Einstein Institution and the work that we do. Our work now is to try to create better resources, educational resources on this topic. And I think now there's a major opportunity to do that, to really innovate education and training in this field so we can make this knowledge more accessible. So we're implementing a new phase at the Einstein Institution so we can better respond to the challenges and opportunities of this moment. Opportunities and challenges like the fact that social media and technology are changing the battlefield. They're reducing the cost of organizing and disseminating information. But the impact of that social media and technology is actually more complicated than some might have hoped for. Leadership is increasingly decentralized, and young people are playing more central roles in some of the emerging movements. They're more engaged than ever before. Movements are also increasingly transnational. Those harming us are some of the same actors. Opponents are sharing information. They're learning from each other. And of course, climate is a huge challenge, a huge global transnational challenge. We're also recognizing, and others are recognizing, the importance of addressing mental health needs and addressing these feelings of powerlessness and despair that we're seeing in communities around the world. So these resources really constitute an antidote to that despair and helplessness, and people are hungry for these resources. Unfortunately, the existing educational infrastructure can't meet the demand for these resources from people around the world. So part of our goal is to try to fill that gap and do it by decentralizing how we both collect information about what people are doing, what's working and not working, and how can we better share that with the groups that might benefit so they're not having to reinvent the wheel. As we all know, there's incredible wisdom and learning in our communities, and this learning is just not getting adequately captured and shared. We have some ideas on how to do that. We've been talking about that over the course of the past few days with many of you, and there's a lot of interest and engagement in this community here on this campus, and also among our amazing network of people who've been thinking deeply on these topics. So it's a major, moment of opportunity and responsibility for all of us, and I would invite all of you to join us. So I'm really looking forward to a great discussion. I want to stop there, but I just want to leave you with one thought. The historian Timothy Snyder, he says that the idea that, everything's going to work out in the end, that it's all going to be okay, that's precisely what will make it not okay. But the opposite is also true. And if we believe that a dark future is inevitable, then that dark future will be inevitable. And I think ultimately it's up to us. So I want to stop there, and in the spirit of learning and sharing, I'd love to hear from all of you about what you're thinking about, what your ideas are, and any questions you might have. So thank you so much. Thank you.
This one's yours. Yeah, you're welcome.
Should we have a seat?
right, thank you, everyone. I'm Liz Beaumont. I'm a professor in the politics department. It's such a thrill to be here with Jamila. I want to remind all of you, as Catherine Mitchell had mentioned earlier, we're really excited to hear your questions. So if you have your note cards and have questions there, we invite you to share them with Elena or Emily Rose, who are kind of wandering around at any point, and we'll be collecting those. To get us started, I do have a couple of questions that I wanted to bring into the conversation. So I think Jamila introduced some of her comments, noting that this just feels like a particularly difficult time on so many levels and in so many places, including the U.S., feeling that there are multiple crises happening at once and that it can feel very demobilizing, demoralizing. It's very easy to feel exhausted. I think a lot of people feel very sapped right now. And so one question for you is whether you feel that there are lessons either from the past or the present of how people somehow muster from a feeling of, kind of at a real low point, a sense of motivation, both to continue working and almost, trying to create hope out of a lot of despair. And if you have some specific examples, maybe from movements from the past or from group, I know you've worked so much with groups around the world who have managed to do this. So any lessons that you've learned from them about how they continue doing this work, I think would be really wonderful to hear about as we think about mustering our own hope and motivation at this time.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's such an important question, and one that, of course, is something a lot of people are grappling with. When the problems do seem overwhelming, how do you even start? And I think, one of my favorite stories is from, the struggle in apartheid South Africa, where also the, African National Congress was trying to mobilize people who felt really overwhelmed by the apartheid system, and said, what could we do to possibly change such an immovable system? And so I think they were bringing up issues like freedom and equality and bringing down the system, and people said that does not connect to anything that I feel capable of doing. So they tried a new tactic, and they said, what do you care about? What are the issues affecting your community? And so they decided to organize on a campaign for clean water. And it wasn't clean water for the whole country. And it wasn't, the whole apartheid system. It was actually a limited issue, but not an unimportant one that was actually very representative of the wider injustice, one on which they had the capacity to fight and win, and one that was, in many ways really important because people were getting sick and dying from this. So they organized on the clean water issue, and they won. And it sort of modeled for the wider movement what could be done in this incremental way. And it was an important way to build confidence, because if movement leaders ask people to take action that is risky or that they don't have the capacity to take, then perhaps their predictable defeat is going to send them the message that they are as helpless as they thought they were. So I think that's obviously very dangerous, and we're seeing that globally, where people don't have the capacity to do these really powerful actions. They're calling for general strikes, and they haven't put the system in place, the networks in place to do it effectively. So obviously incremental change. That doesn't mean we have to wait forever. It just means that we have to be very cognizant about how these individual campaigns, important ones, really bring us closer to our overall objectives.
That's great. I think the idea of building blocks and the idea of breaking, as you said, having a big vision is so important, but then also the idea of not needing to achieve an entire vision at once, and that there can be a scaffolding and steps moving forward from there, smaller steps moving forward that people can actually be working on, kind of one smaller piece at a time. I think that's very important. Another question that I had for you is around another kind of comment that you had made, that if we look at the prevalence of activism right now, we see that there's a tremendous amount of nonviolent activism. There's also a tremendous amount of violence going on. And you had raised the concern that even though there seems to be a proliferation of activism, including nonviolent activism, the sense of being able to gain traction or the sense that people are able to achieve their goals, or the evidence that they've been able to achieve goals seems to be going down. And I wonder if you could mention a little bit from your own research about both why you think that that is the case, and whether any of your research suggests kind of lessons or examples in which people have been able to gain more traction or achieve outcomes that they have set before them, even in the face of maybe, as you said, sometimes it's the force of opposition, sometimes it's the face of government, the force of government repression. So I assume that the reasons can be diverse, but maybe some examples of how movements even now are able to make the forward steps, even small incremental steps sometimes, even though there seems to be a trend in which there's sometimes less capacity.
Yeah, it is a really dangerous trend we're seeing, that we're seeing this global engagement, this rise in people actually being active in the world. You're seeing that reflected on our TV screens and in our news. But unfortunately, we're seeing that in cases where we see these mass mobilizations and we think the change is inevitable, but unfortunately these types of mass demonstrations are pretty easy for systems to withstand. So we're seeing a lot of global engagement and not a lot of really concrete victories. Why is that the case? I think there's probably many factors, but obviously opponent learning, the fact that opponents are getting better at withstanding movements, at anticipating nonviolent action, at undermining it, at kind of trying to do certain things that reduce the effectiveness of nonviolent movements. I mean, they've studied this. They understand it well. They understand it sometimes better than the movements that are fighting them. And so they're getting better. They're getting better, and they're doing things like promoting disunity among movements. They know that causes a decline in effectiveness. They're provoking violence. They're provoking other kinds of unstrategic, action among movements. And I think sometimes it works. We're also seeing movements that are, perhaps relying on social media and technology for their organizing, and this is becoming a problem. Because, it's reducing the cost of organizing, which sounds like a great thing, and I think people thought that these tools are going to be inherently democratizing. First of all, these same tools are obviously available to the opponents, and they're using them with great skill to advance their own interests, to produce misinformation and disinformation, and to cause a lot of problems in society. So they're available to the opponent, and I think that the fact that movements are over-relying on them allows them to kind of skip some of the important steps, the building structures for decision-making, the creating institutions. Back in the day, if you were going to do a mass mobilization of even 1,000 people, you'd have to have a lot of planning in place to do that effectively. Now you can call for a protest and get a huge crowd in the streets, but they may not have the training necessary to do it effectively. They may not understand exactly why they're there. They may not, understand what the objectives are, and they may not have the strength necessary to really, do it sustainably. And so these movements are collapsing. So what do? I think obviously strategic planning, thinking carefully about the situation, doing some analysis to figure out really is a street demonstration, what is the strategic logic of that? Well, it expresses dissatisfaction, but then what are you going to do next? And for that, you need to look at the whole repertoire of actions available, not just the ones on our list, but obviously all the other ones being used around the world, and figure out, what actions are likely to, bring you closer to your objectives? What are the campaigns, and what are the structures that are necessary to do it all effectively? What is the training? Does your group have the training? Does it have the numbers necessary to do an action effectively? And I think asking these questions, even what is the objective, right? Often people are just expressing the dissatisfaction and thinking that, the change is going to be magically produced. So, I think all of these very important basic strategic planning questions can really make movements more effective.
Great, thank you. And actually, you raised yourself a topic that a couple of the questions have been coming in. So I'm going to push a little bit harder on the social media question. So we have one. How can we use social media as a calculated tool for good to make social media effective for groups? As you're mentioning, there's sort of I think when social media first emerged, a lot of people working on civic and democratic engagement imagined that it would be an automatically democratizing positive thing for movements, this tool that would automatically bring a lot of extra capacity, speed, kind of being able to network together many people very quickly. So there was a sort of an imagined view that it was only going to be a good or mostly for the good. And as you're mentioning, as time has gone on, it's both the case that opponents can use these same tools in the same ways, but also that opponents can use these tools disruptively, kind of within or against movements as well. So if you have some thoughts on how social media could be used as a calculated tool for good. The other related question, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on social media and movements. On the one hand, social media has allowed people to organize rapidly, connect further. On the other hand, these platforms have polarized and radicalized people and been used to spread misinformation. How are you thinking about nonviolent actions in online communities or maybe in relationship to these? So you've spoken a little about this, so maybe in a little bit more depth, maybe either with some of the groups that you've worked with recently, how you see them trying to be more intentional, more careful, or more strategic about the use of social media, rather than just kind of assuming that this tool is an automatic good, or that the speed and the quick networking that can occur through it is an automatic benefit, as opposed to possibly in some ways actually being not necessarily a detriment completely, but having a downside to it.
I mean, for that, I would turn to people younger than myself. I mean, how are these tools being used? In what ways can they actually create community rather than do the opposite? I mean, it's something for which we have a lot of questions. I mean, when I came into the organization, it was 2002. The internet was obviously around, but it wasn't so widely available. And I saw how these ideas were spreading, and they were spreading like, analog spreading. I mean, imagine that. People would find books and take them from one country to another, and now we're seeing, and then I saw the evolution of how these ideas spread, and then access to not just tools of change, but also understanding what's happening in countries far away, builds a level of solidarity that, we're not alone. This idea that our situation is so unique is hugely demobilizing. The fact that other people are struggling on these issues, I mean, is a huge source of, inspiration and the belief that you can make change too. Now, the question is, what's the lesson people are taking away from it? And if it's to mimic what others are doing without thinking about how do these, actions and techniques apply in their situation, I mean, that's the dangerous part, because I think social media is, kind of allowing this contagion effect, and that's in a way great, but it also means that maybe some of the understanding is a bit shallow. So how can we better capture the sort of behind the scenes stuff, not someone, there was this policy that happened, this violation, so we saw in Romania how, the government in the middle of the night changed a policy, while everyone was sleeping, and of course, social media allowed, people to say, no, I don't think so. And then, mass mobilizations in the street. And so it left one wondering, and they were very successful, right? The policy was pulled back. But the problem is, as an outsider, if you're looking at that, the way our media is going to report it is that people were pissed off, they went in the streets, the change magically happened, and they're going to attribute it somehow possibly just to the government changing their mind. But I think there were structures that were created in advance of that violation, and it was only those structures and those systems and networks that were mobilized using the social media that I think made that such a powerful kind of campaign. And so, I guess there's so much more to say about that. It's the fact that we can observe these things in real time and how they can be inspirational is important. Now, what we're looking at right now, what our organization is doing is, how can we better capture this in ways that can allow people to tell their stories, but to do it in a way that really kind of captures the strategic insight so that we can share this learning that's happening, intergenerationally, so that older folks can learn from younger ones also, right? And vice versa. And that we can learn across regions and across issues. We tend to see the patterns, and there's so many that I think are really quite generalizable. And this idea that we're completely unique is, as I said, dangerous to people who are living under oppression. I think the biggest thing I would say that social media has done is really allow us to see that we're not alone, and that there's things we can learn, we can access resources. There's people who have dedicated their lives to thinking deeply. I mean, that we're having this conversation is probably a source of inspiration for people. That's what we've heard. So now, Liz, I think you asked a totally different question, but you can see I'm passionate about this. So if I missed something,
No, I think that was a good answer. Although I do think, I mean, I'll kind of press the point that you had made, that it seems that maybe the question of how to use social media effectively is one that is still being developed, and it's being developed by the people who are the most current users and developers of those technologies, rather than maybe people from older generations who are less likely to be using them as creatively and so on. And so maybe it's yet to be determined and shared how groups are trying to become more savvy about using social media, using online communication in the ways that are most effective, without falling into some of the pitfalls that you're mentioning. So maybe that's further research to be done that our current undergraduate and graduate students can be contributing to, trying to learn from their own groups and others. I have another question kind of going in another direction, which is wanting to think about the creation of unified shared visions. And so maybe this goes to your point about that the idea of people, kind of both wanting and needing to know that they're not alone, but also being able to form kind of bridges and connections among them. So this is a question: what are the strategies for articulation between small community groups for creating a unified shared vision? Specifically between people in cities and outside of them, for instance, indigenous, peasant, and urban groups. So maybe people divided by space, maybe people divided by class, maybe people divided by other kinds of dimensions, as well as the geography. How do you develop a shared vision? How do you build a coalition that involves maybe not only a particular group that's especially affected by a particular issue or problem or injustice, but also those who may become or could feel a sense of solidarity or concern for those groups as well?
A tough question for sure. I mean, I think we talked about it a little bit already, but ultimately, isn't it about asking people what's important to them also and not speaking for others? I think, when we see these movements, we tend to think that they coming out of the capitals and elites are, coming up with this vision because they have education and they know better and they can speak for all of us. But I think the best movements have taken, really understood the society, understood what are the actual issues affecting people, and so articulated it in a way that can really draw in diverse groups. So, I'm thinking about this again in a country like Afghanistan, where there's massive malnutrition and massive problems. And, I think this is in a way why there's certain kind of groups that have been so compelling, because they, have I'm talking here about the Taliban, but there's ways in which they've really come from the people and understood the people in a way that the previous government unfortunately did not. So I think it would go back to really understanding the society, and that's really I don't think it's an academic analytical exercise, right? But it does require us to identify who are the different groups in our society. How do they suffer under the current system? What does a better society for them look like? And they do often know, or they always know. They have many, many ideas on how to do that. And I think we're often not taking the time to do that.
Thank you. I have a really interesting one here, which is, what is a good nonviolent last resort? which I'm assuming maybe this is when people feel that they've been pushed to the wall. And this may be sort of at points in time or moments of crisis where people can feel maybe that the turn to violence could feel like the only thing left. And so I'm not sure if this is what the questioner was trying to get at. That if you really feel that you're at the 11th hour, or kind of the moment of no return, which sometimes people are feeling with particular issues, that kind of that it's past the breaking point. And so what is the move now? What is the nonviolent strategic move when you feel that you've exhausted maybe a lot of prior efforts? Probably, oftentimes people feel that there's been effort for a long time, that it hasn't been very successful, and then is there kind of a sort of what might be a next step if you feel that you're kind of at a last resort, or at a critical turning point where you're really not sure what could happen next?
I mean, I think it would vary quite a bit from case to case. I think this idea that, people taking risk, a lot being asked of them day after day, facing repression, and, if they're at a breaking point, obviously that's a really dangerous point in a movement. And so movements have done a lot of different things. They've recognized that asking people to continue to take those risks, to continue to face repression, is dangerous and is in a way pointless. In fact, it could be very counterproductive if it causes this shift to violence. So they've done many things, like a stay-at-home strike, where if going in the streets is a show of power, well, so is staying at home and emptying the streets. So this idea that if you're trying to convey discipline, if you're conveying power, then calling for a stay at home and having no one show up is actually an incredibly powerful display of people's dissatisfaction. So, I guess it's to look at these methods and other ones and to figure out, how do you reduce the risk to people but actually achieve powerful objectives? And there's lots of other ways to do it than to, face off to security forces, as we're seeing in different parts of the world. But ultimately, this is about saying no, using basic human stubbornness, and that, is in abundance in the world. And so people are pretty good at it, but I would say, I guess a means of last resort, I think, that doesn't mean that at the moment where a movement is facing repression, it may be because it's more powerful than ever. Because obviously, the interesting thing is that as effectiveness goes up, so also does repression, because a movement is suddenly a threat to an opponent. And this is precisely when it may be that you go back to the drawing board. Live to see another day. Planning and education, capacity building. It's not just what you do to prepare for the struggle, it is the struggle. So maybe we don't think about doing struggle as all of the mass mobilization stuff, but everything else that societies around the world and communities around the world are doing.
That's very interesting. It makes me think that sometimes people who study social movements will talk about kind of a dance or a tango between the movements, and often they're imagining how governments are responding, that there are kind of almost set pieces. The movement does this, the government does that. The movement does this, the government does that. And it seems that maybe one thing that you're saying is either to think in a very creative, different kind of way, that if the government is expecting another version of the same move that has been being practiced by a particular group or is commonly practiced by groups of that type, trying to think of something that is not expected and very creative and very different, that may be attention grabbing in a completely different way than maybe what had been a more common or kind of more frequently practiced tactic of that group or of groups in that society, could really be a game changer, maybe, is I think
Yes.
what you're suggesting, that doing something really creative, mixing things up, stay home. If you've been going out into the streets, suddenly stay home, and everyone is off the streets and not working or not in schools and so on. It's like a massive strike.
I think you're seeing some of the most interesting examples of, of this type of, creative use of nonviolent action in societies where there's a lot of repression. I mean, we saw a case, it was humorous if it wasn't so sad. This, young kid in Kazakhstan, he was protesting anti-protest laws. So he went into the main square with a giant poster that had nothing on it. And he was seeing what would happen, and of course the media arrived, so did the police. They started arresting him. And he said, "What are you arresting me for? I'm not even saying anything." So I think doing this in a way to make the system look ridiculous, because they don't like that, right? Because, I mean, it also reduces fear, this idea that you can actually laugh at these oppressive opponents. So, the use of humor and art and theater, I mean, we can't discount that. But thinking about these art and humor in a revolutionary way, that it's actually about, such powerful tools to convey ideas, to express solidarity, to offer solutions, to offer that alternative vision, to say we're celebrating life. I think there's so many incredibly inspiring ways. We're looking at how we can integrate that into our own work. We're not just about, giving people skills. That's not what this is about. It's also building community, building trust among people, really celebrating ourselves, celebrating our accomplishments, our history. I think art and theater and poetry and all the rest of it helps to do that.
Great, thank you. I'm going to give you a bit of an easier question now. You've been getting some really hard ones. This is
The hard question.
this is a question. What are some examples of partial successes or pitfalls of nonviolent movements in the past that you or your group has studied? So we've seen kind of maybe a mix of gains and losses, or some of this partial successes, some of the pitfalls that you might be able to recall from one or two examples, maybe?
I mean, I think if we look at the uprisings of the Arab Spring, observers would see that, in fact, they didn't get everything that they wanted. That in many of them, and obviously there's a whole set of countries there. Some of them have, in the case of Syria, led to a massive humanitarian crisis and a civil war. But if you look at cases like Tunisia, which, for many people is a success. I happen to go to Tunisia a lot, and, people are still dissatisfied with the pace of change there. After a dictatorship of decades, right? And they realizing that it's a process, that you achieve your initial victory, but then it kind of never stops, right? I mean, you're gonna have to stay vigilant and stay mobilized, that once you win or whatever that is, achieve your objectives, it's not the time to then sit back and relax. And so, in a way, these are all sort of, partial victories. And I think in many of the cases where we see the partial victories, you're finding the end of a regime, like in the case of Egypt, but you're finding that actually the system didn't really change, that it was really the military that was largely in control and the military that is now largely in control. So we're seeing kind of initial successes that are often very shallow, and the need to really, again, I think, not only gain initial objectives, but see them through. And that requires you to stay mobilized and to see this as a process.
Well, that may be kind of a good segue into a question that came from our Zoom. It raises the question, it says, one of last year's Right Livelihood laureates is Aminatu Haider, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, the Saharan Gandhi, who's been leading her people in nonviolent resistance against Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara. The U.S. is the only country that's formally recognized Morocco's illegal annexation, and she advocates that people not only cheer her, but also use nonviolent action to change U.S. policy as well. What are your thoughts on solidarity between human rights activists here in the U.S., in the USA, with those struggling against repressive U.S.-backed regimes?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I think one we need to grapple with as those of us who, are Americans and taking part in the system, and the way in which we're really contributing to and making possible oppression of other people. So in the case of Western Sahara, I think, I'm not a specialist. I think I might know who asked that question. I think, we have to pay attention to these struggles, especially the ones in which our government is complicit. And oftentimes, there are these powerful struggles taking place, like in Western Sahara, like in the Palestinian territories, like elsewhere where our country is actively playing a role. And I think as regular citizens, we have a responsibility, obviously, to, find ways to pressure our own systems, and to also do that by bringing attention to these struggles. I think when we don't pay attention to them, I think when we don't highlight them, we don't take an effort to know about them, as much as they are trying to broadcast what they're doing, and many of them are, when we fail to pay attention to them, I think we're basically sending a message that, it's violent struggle that gets attention, that all of these successes and important ways in which people are struggling, are not important and not effective. So as regular citizens, obviously we have a role in terms of, who we elect and how we participate in our own democratic systems, but also just as students, as regular folks, making an effort to understand really how we as Americans are complicit and how people are trying to resist that, and finding ways to support them. As we said, movements are increasingly transnational, so we can't afford to just ignore them. There are ways in which, there's such incredible stuff going on around the world. Right now with the invasion of Ukraine, you're seeing how it's like global solidarity for Ukrainians. I'm not just talking about the support for the military action, but all the other ways in which people are trying to support Ukrainians. And I think, people are trying to figure out what skills do you have, what resources you have that could be helpful to movements. And I think we can try to explore that and see how we can, do more than just be inspired by people, pay lip service to them, and then kind of move on back to our lives, but really see how we can support them in other ways.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question that's maybe a hard question, and I think one thing that we've been seeing in the U.S. news just in the last 2 days is this huge outpouring of protests by those who are opposed to the idea of overturning Roe, also counter-protests for those who would favor it. And there's a tremendous kind of energy, in the streets. It's been nonviolent protests. You would certainly say that's an example of this larger trend of seeing a lot of activism, a lot of nonviolent movement. But I think you're suggesting that one of the challenges is for movements to think beyond kind of the protests and the demonstrations of the day, and what it means to sustain a movement and try to start to think strategically. So one question would be, not necessarily for these groups at this time, but for groups that are in the moment and experiencing a lot of energy and attention around a flashpoint. What from your work or from the groups that you've studied, how do you continue as you said, the mobilization, the goals, the work has to continue after the initial energy maybe has dissipated. So do you have recommendations for groups that have to shift from an immediate response or kind of an immediate outpouring of emotion to thinking long-term, about a long-term strategy for change, and what does that look like to move from the strategy of the streets and the kind of immediate attention that gains to the idea of building an intentional strategy for change that goes beyond the immediate responses?
I think, Liz, I would turn the question to you. It's something I had hoped to talk to you about. I think that there are certain skills and capacities that are really good for resistance, and then there's the ones that are needed to actually transition and to create legislative, concrete victories. And I think those are very much related, but, we need to have both. And so I'm interested in hearing about, what your thoughts are and what kind of cases are helpful in thinking about that.
Oh boy, I didn't think I was going to have to answer that question. I thought I just got to ask it. I'm not sure I'm not sure I have a good response either, but I do. And actually, this is something that came up in another forum that I was participating in around movements for social justice. That was part of the naming of the John Lewis College, and the fact that very often, I think both now at this moment in time, when we're at a low point of trust for institutions, when we're at a low point of feeling for many people that institutions actually represent them, that there is kind of maybe a growing desire to only participate through activism and only participate through protest, and to, I'll call it, abdicate institutions and abdicate electoral politics, because there's a feeling that it's not truly representative, it's so broken, there's so much distrust. And it does seem to me that even though it's understandable for people to feel that way, I'm not saying that I don't understand the cynicism or the distrust, that's also deeply problematic, that if we want to think about lasting change and policy change, giving up on the field of policy and giving up on institutions and is essentially to cede that power. And I think your approach and your desire for people to understand power has to also be understanding the power that operates through institutions, and that lasting change has to be able to kind of operate through those institutions as well. And so maybe thinking about the need to think both long-term and also to think about strategies that move through institutions and with leadership and partners that are either currently in institutions or willing to get out there and try to get into institutions, to me seems like it has to be part of a long-term strategy that, as I said, for good reason, many movements don't want to be participating in both, kind of movement politics and institutional or electoral politics. But it seems that's a real problem if you want to have enduring change.
Thank you.
Okay, so a couple more questions, I think. One that came up was whether you would want to say a little bit about the fact that in many of the movements that we see now, and historically, young people and college students have played some of the most important roles. And I don't know if you have either reflections on that or thoughts about that, about why it is that college students, both historically and in the present, have been so very important for, sometimes for initiating movements, sometimes for kind of joining them, sometimes for helping to carry them forward after they've already been started. But then also the point that you brought up about the idea of the possibility of more intergenerational solidarity and cooperation, that I think we are at a moment in time where we have a lot of young people interested in kind of movements and so on. We also have older generations who have come out of their own participation in movements and have a lot of knowledge, have a lot of experience that they may be willing and interested in sharing, but there don't seem to be a lot of kind of opportunities or efforts to kind of forge, intergenerational conversations, intergenerational sharing of movement ideas or growth. And so if you have any thoughts, either about the particularities of college students as participants, but also the idea of movements from past generations and relationships between activists of past generations, trying to find ways from both directions, from the younger direction and from the older direction, to have more intergenerational cooperation.
Well, I think we know it is the case that young people have played really central role in movements. That's nothing new. Why is it the case? Probably there's specialists on that topic. I used to think it was, maybe they have a little more time, they're gutsy. They haven't been, I think they believe, they're very strongly principled. There's a really amazing movement taking place right now of young people in Pakistan, in the kind of like border area between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and in many ways it mirrors sort of the March for Our Lives and this kind of shaming of the government, that they've failed to protect people, that the military has been very active, that there's been a lot of killings, extrajudicial killings in the area, and that they're basically stuck between the violence of the Pakistani military and the violence of the insurgency that's going on there, and the drone attacks and all of this. So they've built this massive movement, this incredible movement, and it's been just so remarkable that they haven't just said this. They've said basically this is a movement of young people, but now it's a movement of like women and children and older folks and truly intergenerational. And I'm really interested in how that was made possible. I think they basically have created a really strong narrative, and that narrative is that this government, this society has failed to protect us, and so we have to do it ourselves, and we can't wait for that. And we've seen that narrative by other young people. We see that narrative being used by young people in the climate movement. That they can't, business as usual, waiting for leaders to fix things is just not going to work. And there are these flashpoints. In the case of the Pakistan movement, it was the killing of a young man who the government said was an insurgent, and he was actually just an aspiring model. And he's very active on social media. So people were able to point to his social media and said that's not the social media of an insurgent. So it's amazing how they're also using, I think, the technology and the social media to organize and learning from one another. It's really remarkable to see. We're in a lot of these movement spaces, and sometimes we see it's always like really young folks. Sometimes it's the older ones, and we're seeing that the two are not often talking to each other, and we're thinking about ways that we can address that. I think that this idea that we did it before, we know everything that you should do exactly as we did, that it's not very compelling for young people who are facing very different challenges today. So how can we both learn and understand that we're operating in very different environments? And I think maybe approaching it with some humility, that we have something to learn from one another, might be a great way to kind of foster that intergenerational learning. But for us specifically at the Einstein Institution, we think kind of developing case studies where you capture some of this knowledge. I mean, I think in the old days, we used to do research where we would talk to like old movement leaders that, did a particular action, like whether it was in the apartheid movement or, in India or elsewhere. And, they would develop like a case account, like a historical account of, this is what they did, this is why they did it, how they did it, what was the outcome of it. So, that was a way to capture the intergenerational learning. And I think maybe we can do better, or maybe we keep doing that too. But maybe there's ways in which maybe social media could be used, or other kind of multimedia resources to kind of capture these stories, but do it in a way, again, that kind of allows us to distill wisdom and insight in a way that is applicable across time and across cultures and things like that. And so we're really exploring how to do that. We need lots of people to help us with that.
Great. We have a question about what can we learn from global activists about what's working? So do you have any examples of a group or a movement that you feel gives a nice example of how there can be at least partial successes?
Well, I think there's a lot to be inspired by the climate movement. I think some of the, most innovative examples are, campaigns that recognize that, the existing systems, the existing kind of their political leaders are not going to protect communities that are being kind of violated in different ways by like anti-fracking companies and energy companies. And they're realizing what's really needed is a disruptive capacity that really targets what allows the violations to be possible and disrupts really the flow of capital, of resources to those companies. I think, one of the cases that I always, I'm very inspired by and that I think is very informative for us is the Anti-Fracking movement in Canada, where basically it was a heavily focused on capacity building, so basically training, education, going to communities that were going to be impacted by these energy companies and saying, we don't know what the effects of these actions are by these energy companies. Perhaps we should learn more. And so doing a lot of educational work, but education for the purpose of really mobilizing people to develop a capacity that in itself, they saw it as a deterrent, right? So can we develop capacity that not only helps us to conduct a fight, but actually communicates that there's going to be a cost to a violation. So maybe you stop the violation from even happening because the opponent realizes there's a political cost, there's a financial cost, and it's just not worth it for them. I mean, how do we kind of bring that into our struggles? So I think that the climate movement, I think that's a really important insight, and that's an insight that a number of other people or groups have been using. I think that the umbrella movement in Hong Kong is one that was incredibly disciplined, that was really, really, again, focused on capacity building and education. Everyone thinks that it was like an eruption of anger. Well, obviously it wasn't, because there's no way you could have had that level of organizing and discipline if you didn't have all of these months and years of planning. So again, it's the behind the scenes stuff that we don't get to see. So we don't realize that effectiveness is not by accident, right? Nonviolent discipline is not by accident. You'd see these huge mobilizations, you'd see them be incredibly disciplined, and then, you'd have a protest go through, and then they'd come in and not only pick up the trash afterwards, but pick up their recycling. And everyone was like, oh, because they're so organized, that's just part of the culture. But it wasn't the case. There was actually a huge decentralized network of, people trained for this, like special volunteers, a whole system where you had people that had different roles. They did a lot of analysis and thinking. If we're going to have a protest on a super hot day, let's make sure people's needs are met. Let's make sure that there's medics. Let's make sure that they have bottles of water, stuff like that, just super organized. So I think, that is an incredibly important movement that we can learn from, maybe one of the most innovative, and also how they use technology in a way that was not kind of opening them up to surveillance, or, it was really like, how do we create decisions quickly or make decisions quickly in a democratic way? We don't want to create these top-down systems within our own movement. So, the fact that they use technology to say, we have to vote on this issue, do we go, do we do this protest, or do we kind of sit back on this one? And and technology was a way, like using Telegram and other tools. They did it particularly effectively.
Yeah, that might be a really nice segue. You're going to be doing an entire workshop for people tomorrow. And do you mind maybe connecting some of what you've been talking about, or giving a little bit of a preview of the idea of trying to do, kind of hands-on skill building, planning for campaigns, and what kinds of things that people who are thinking about coming tomorrow or just want to know more about what the workshops might involve. If you could give a couple of examples or some of the things that you've learned and are going to be sharing with people.
Yeah, so what we're doing tomorrow is obviously builds on many decades of work, but in many ways is also quite new and innovative. We realized that, the sort of lecture-based thing doesn't work. I think lots of people figured that's not the best way to do education. So we also realized that in our field that, there's a certain, how do we use a day together for a community to be brought together, to think together about what is possible and how they can begin to develop a strategy for the issues that they care about. This was kind of our issue. And our long-term goal is how can we develop this capacity to do these trainings, maybe without us in the room. Because the idea is to scale them. And it's not especially empowering for outsiders to be there. Sometimes it's risky, sometimes it's expensive. People are not going to have access to, groups that do these trainings. So how do we kind of develop a almost training template that can be used by people to do effective, strategic planning and education in their own communities and create these learning communities to do that. That's our goal. And so I think for tomorrow, what we're trying to do is kind of develop these components of such a training template, if you will, and begin to, shall we say, try it out, learn together. I was going to say test, but I mean that in the best sense. I think that for educational material, for these resources to be truly relevant, to be well thought through, they need to be created with the community and the audience for it. So that's part of what we see tomorrow as an opportunity to do that. It's a carefully crafted workshop that is a series of, yes, presenting content, but also a lot of exercises that are meant to really understand there's a lot of wisdom among people who have been thinking about these things for a long time, who have been experimenting with nonviolent action. And so how do we kind of blend that wisdom? We see an important piece of this, a couple of main parts to it. The first is, we need to have a common understanding, a baseline understanding of what it is we're even talking about. So we want to kind of collectively develop that. We also want to give people a tool for analysis. Most people who want change in their communities, they understand the issues. But I think to really kind of mobilize people, you need to have more than a surface level understanding of the issues, and to do the analysis of really what makes that system possible, what makes that harmful policy possible, and then how do we collectively disrupt it and build the alternative. I mean, it's a big ask, right? But I think we can't possibly develop a strategy without doing this deep thinking in advance. And I think the third piece, which is also new for us, is to look at mental health needs of activists, but also how do we see that as movement building. So while we are big fans of yoga and deep breathing, we're thinking actually more about how do you kind of develop strategies that deliver hope, that build confidence among people, that allow them to win incremental wins, that can help them to do that. How can they be sustainable in the face of risk and oppression and asking of their time and energy, and a whole series of other topics. And yeah, my colleagues here are going to be, been working hard on developing this, and we're together going to be presenting that tomorrow. Really excited.
That's great, and it makes me think that part of what you're trying to do is also maybe change the notion of what leadership of movements is and what it involves. That leadership of movements is essentially every person in a movement, as opposed to one charismatic figure who stands up and sort of gives the vision and leads everyone forward. Instead it's a process and it's a community. And that people are interested in forming effective movements. The more that they can understand that and believe in their own leadership, have confidence in their own leadership, in kind of not the maybe the stereotype of the charismatic figurehead, but the leadership of the participant, the leadership of the collaborator, the leadership of the person who keeps showing up, I think is so much of what keeps movements mobilized and moving, and it sounds like maybe you're trying to help everyone have those skills rather than teaching people how to lead a movement.
Yeah, we've been thinking a lot about leadership. I mean, it's so central to all of this. I mean, how do we imagine leadership? And it used to be that, people imagine you need a charismatic leader who holds all the wisdom and then decides what to do and then tells the rest of us, and then, that's it, we do it. And I think maybe that was based on a model where, we didn't have access to knowledge. I mean, people were always leaders in their own community. We know that. But I think that, this idea that we need decentralized leadership is dangerous, is a liability. But also the opposite, that we need, we also need to understand, how do we kind of foster leadership at the local level so that people can design action, right? So you can figure out what to do that makes sense at the local level, but that is also in accordance with maybe wider goals, statewide, national, transnational objectives. So I think part of developing this capacity to do that effectively, to understand what does education and planning look like, to be able to design action or to do action that is truly effective, I mean, it does require skills. And so, we need those skills at every level of the movement, at the most local. I think part of it is that we need to hold our leaders in our nonviolent movements accountable. So when they're, suggesting or, recommending tactics or a certain course of action, we can ask whether those truly make sense for our communities. So this is also about democratizing the movement itself. And part of that is about really fostering leadership. So we're thinking a lot about that, about how to maybe, incorporate coaching into our work as well, how to, see coaching as an important skill in nonviolent resistance as well.
That's great. I think we are out of time, so we're going to have to say thank you to Jamila. Please join me in thanking her for sharing this. I think there is some space at the workshop. Am I right about that? If you have not signed up, it is open to all undergraduates, community members, any interested parties. You do have to register, and I think they're doing that at the table in the back. So we would invite you, if you want to learn more and get more of a hands-on training, and also, as we're saying, a different way of thinking about movement building than maybe people have thought about in the past. This is a wonderful opportunity to learn from Jamila and her whole team here. So thank you, Jamila. This has really been wonderful. And thank you to the Zoom audience as well as our live audience.
This has been wonderful. Thank you so much.